So last week on the share, I attempted to understand certain things which are almost incomprehensible, because fundamentally the main problem that people have with the existence of God is not so much with his existence, because when you look at the world, when you look at the universe, when you look at life and everything that it produces, it's very obvious that there's a God who created all of this with a certain design. Because the essence of creation includes the concept of design. Everything has a very specific design and a certain function. And such a massive quantity of design is only possible with a super intelligent mind. So the existence of God is never a problem. The real problem is the behavior of God. Because if we say that God created the world, and we have to come to that conclusion, the question is, what ensues? And what ensues is a tremendous amount of suffering and pain. The amount of suffering and pain that mankind has experienced is frankly enormous. And since God is really a giver, God does not need anything in return. Why does God deliver such a state of agony and pain? If you add up all the wars and all the pain that mankind suffers in relationships and his ability to support himself, it comes out to be unimaginably large. And the amount of pain that ensues from this task is astounding. So the real question about the existence of God is not whether he exists or not. If a person analyzes his attitude to God, what does he really think about God? He finds it impossible to define. And what's impossible to understand about God is why he created a world that consists of such pain. So on that basis, the person says, well, maybe there isn't a God. But he's not actually denying the creation, the design of creation. What he's denying is that God could not have created the world in a certain sense, because how can you explain the level of consummate pain and agony that mankind has experienced in human history? And this is the real problem. And this problem has never been answered. I mean, all philosophers attempt to understand the purpose of creation and so on. But they cannot reconcile the experience of creation with the purpose of creation. And that's why attempts are made constantly to disprove the fact that God created the world. But the astounding question is not so much if God created the world. The astounding question is, why did he create a world which has to work to produce certain results? What Jewish philosophy says, especially in the Kabbalah, in the Ashkafa, is the concept of Nam Sufa. And Nam Sufa means that what God wanted to do in creating the world is not only giving man dominance in the creation, but he wanted to make man eternal. So the purpose of creation is to create an entity which can coexist with God in eternity. And this is really the fundamental purpose of creation, because God has great goodness and is ultimately perfectly good. What he wanted to do is to give this goodness to mankind, and this goodness is nothing more than eternal creation, eternal existence. And this is the purpose of why God created the world. The world that he created for this purpose is called Olam Haba, the future world. But in order to achieve the purpose in Olam Haba, God created another parallel existence that really precedes Olam Haba. And this parallel existence is called Olam Hazeh, this world. And this is the world which produces the problem, that produces the question of why there is so much pain in this world. And the answer that the Kabbalists give fundamentally, and for example, the Ramchal, Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto really says, the answer to that question is that mankind, God understood that in order for mankind to truly deserve eternity, he would have to earn it in some way, that he could not sustain the ability to have eternity without contributing to its existence, which means he would have to earn it. Eternity would have to be given to man as a reward for his earning it, not as a gift, because, mankind does not deserve the gift. And the concept is that mankind is given existence as a gift and not through earning it, mankind will then develop a certain sense of what's called shame. And this is referred to as the principle of Namdik Sufa, which means bread of shame. So therefore, mankind would have to do something to actually deserve this. Because God realized that if mankind doesn't do anything to earn it, but is simply given eternal existence, that he will have a certain feeling of shame, which more correctly points to the fact of what's called a disempowerment. Mankind will feel disempowered in his acquisition of eternity, of living forever, without having earned it by himself. So that's why God created this physical world, to put the man in a situation where he earns his keep in Olam Haba. That means that the actual existence of man is beyond time. Eternity does not mean endless time. What it really means is that he exists beyond time, where existence is not measured in terms of time. Time does not exist. Not only does time not exist, but space doesn't exist. In other words, the distance between two entities in this domain is not encountered by a space, which means that every person in creation is part and parcel to some extent of every other person. Mankind does not have an individual existence as such. Mankind has the existence of what? Of an organism. An organism is a body where all the components of the body all serve the same function, and that's to keep it alive. And this is called an organism. The organism of the human body is such that if a person will have to replace one of the organs, when this organ is replaced due to some pathology, what happens is that the body rejects the organ, and it says, this is not my organ, and therefore I don't want it. The body will reject an organ which is given to it by another person. It only accepts its own organ. And that's what it means to say that mankind is an organism. That even though he's comprised of separate parts, all these parts come together to affect the same task, that they should affect the process of life. And there are many organs that do this. So mankind is called an organism, and that's its real nature. That means in an organism, there's really no such thing as a stranger. Every cell in the human body knows every other cell in the human body. The human body is an organism where every component knows every other component. There's no such thing really as a stranger among the components of the human body. And that's the ultimate definition of an organism. So this is exactly what eternal existence is. Mankind is a superorganism where there is no time and there is no space. Not only that, mankind is not composed of a substance. We say that man is spiritual and has a soul. But in actuality, man is not composed really of a substance. The substance of a man is not really a substance. So the fundamental question is, what is man actually composed of? And so on. But when you really think about it, there's another question that really has to be asked, which is the most profound question of all, and it's difficult for me to explain this question. But I'm going to really make an attempt, and I hope that I'm being clear. It's a very subtle question. We say that mankind exists. We say that entities exist. We say that God exists. And the question is, what is existence exactly? Can we understand it? Well, the simplest meaning of it all is existence is being. Because mankind exists, he's in the state of being. To exist is to be. And being is such that it can either be or not to be. That's really the question. To be or not to be. Because either you can exist or you can't exist. And that's really the subtlety of it. But the real question is, what exactly is existence? What does it mean that you exist? And what does it mean that you don't exist? What exactly is existence? That you appear? Well, what does that have to do with an entity? An entity is defined by its qualities. An entity is something which is. It has certain qualities. And therefore, it is. It exists. So what does that mean that it exists? That it has an appearance? In contrast to what? No appearance? Why is existence necessary? This is a very difficult question to answer. The fundamental question is, what is existence itself? It seems to be something where you appear, that you appear in reality. You are said to exist. What exactly does that mean, that you appear, as opposed to you don't appear? So the truth of the matter is, we have no real answer for that. We don't really know what it means to exist or not to exist. Only the contrast is fundamentally there. Existence to be, non-existence not to be. But we really don't understand and can't comprehend the fact that we are. What does that mean? Not only that, we say that God exists. God exists and is not a case where he doesn't exist. What does this mean? God always exists. That means that God, in a certain way, is synonymous with his existence. God doesn't exist. God is not a subject which possesses the verb to be. God is not, since God exists, is not a two-word sentence where the subject is God, and the ability is that God actually exists. But since God was always here, what we say is a certain thing. We say God is existence itself. God is the act of being itself. He doesn't possess the being. What it is that God does not possess the quality of life or the quality of existence. In other words, existence is not a quality which God possesses or has. It's not something which is attached to God. God is his existence. He's identical with it, and it is him. We call that existence as part of his essence. That's who God is. We, however, human beings, don't exist or don't have to exist. Existence, with reference to us, is something we possess. Existence is a process. That's what we see. Existence is a certain process which gives us being. And this process is something which we possess. It's outside of us. And if it becomes it's inside of us, suddenly we exist. And if it's outside of us and attached to us, but it's not part of us itself, then it's possible that we don't exist. So existence for the human being is a process which is either attached to him or not. Whereas the existence of God is always a part of him, because God is existence. He is the process of existence itself. That's why the name of God, which is Yud and the Hey, the Vav and the Hey, when we make a blessing, we say, blessed be God, and that's symbolized by the word Yud, Hey, and the Vav and the Hey. And what does that word mean that refers to God? Well, that word means existence. So therefore, when we refer to God, we say Mr. Existence. That's the actual name of God, Mr. Existence. And why is that? Why is God called Mr. Existence? Because God does not exist as a possession. It's something that he's attached to. God is the process of existence itself. He is identical to existence, and so on. So that's the way it was always understood by the sages, the great sages of the Talmud and the Kabbalists. God exists because he is the process. But the real question that we're always asking is, what exactly is existence? What does that mean? Does that mean God appears and therefore he exists? And why do you have to appear or not appear? What does that have to do with the quality to what God is? And there's no answer to that. There's no real answer to that question. Why existence is even necessary and what existence means. So in order to answer this question, if you give it deep thought, there's another way to answer the question, and it puts you much closer to who God is. That's right. The answer to this question is a completely different concept, and it gives you a much deeper understanding what existence is and what existence has to do with God. The most fundamental attribute of a human being, although it's not really considered totally fundamental, and its importance is not really understood, is the concept of self-awareness. What does that mean, self-awareness? Well, it means that man is aware of himself. What that actually means is even more than that. Man has an innate knowledge that he is. That's it. Self-awareness is the awareness of self. So what mankind is a type of being that knows that it is. And how does it know that it is? It knows that it is by itself. Nobody tells you that you exist. You know it by yourself. So therefore, you contain the knowledge that you exist. And the truth of the matter, if you really think about it, that's what self-awareness is. In other words, I'm going to say a very strange concept. There's no such thing as existence. There's no such thing as to be. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't go anywhere. What existence is actually awareness. If you know that you are, that is existence. So therefore, existence is not a process that applies to you and gives you being. Existence is a concept of knowledge. It's a certain knowing. And that knowing emanates from you. In other words, you know that you are by yourself, through yourself. That's how you know. We say that you know that you exist because you have a brain, but that's not the answer. The brain is the physical instrumentation that indicates that you exist. But what existence is the knowledge that you are, period. And mankind is said to possess this knowledge. He knows that he is by himself and through himself. So we say, therefore, that the fundamental aspect of a person is simply self-knowledge. And the most critical part of self-knowledge is that man knows that he is. And we call that existence. What we call existence is really nothing more than the fact that man has knowledge of himself by himself. Wherever that knowledge is, it's contained in its essence. God, man's essence is a knowledge that he is. And we refer to that by the term existence. But there's no such thing as existence. I maintain that existence is not an actual action. It's not a state of being. Existence is nothing more than a certain knowledge that man possesses about himself, through himself. And we call that existence. And the truth of the matter is, if we think about existence as a form of knowledge, the knowledge that comes from oneself about oneself. And that's called existence. So if you possess this knowledge that you are said to exist. And if you don't possess this knowledge that you are, you don't exist. What that means is that existence is something which is contained within the being itself. It's something that emanates from the being. Mankind possesses the ability, each person possesses the ability to know that he is. And that's called self-awareness. So therefore, mankind is said to be in the ultimate essence, a self, the being called a self. In other words, if you are looking at another person, and then you say to him, one person says to another, "Who are you? Are you the clothes that you wear?" So the person says to you, "No, I am not the clothes that I wear." So what you say to the person, "Okay, so the clothes that you wear is attached to you. So take it off, since it is not you." Suddenly you become aware of the person's soul. So then you say to the person, "Are you a soul? Is that what you are?" So the person says to you, "No, I am not a body, and I am not a soul. So then you say to the person, okay, take that off. So when you take off your body, if you could, and if you take off your soul, which you could, what's left? So the answer is, what's left is the self, S-E-L-F, and that is an entity that knows that it is by itself. And that's the definition of a self, is the intrinsic aspect of who you are. And that's the most critical aspect of all, that your awareness of yourself comes from you. It doesn't come from anything else. It is in you, within you, by you, and therefore that self is called an itself. It's the most fundamental act of what a person is. It's responsible for the concept of his awareness. So ultimately what you say and what we realize is that you are an entity called a self, and that entity is continuously involved in an active awareness. I know that I am because I am. So therefore we say that's called divinity. In other words, the most fundamental thing about God is that he knows that he is. Does God know himself? Yes. He has a self which knows that he is. So God also possesses self-awareness. Mankind possesses that also. So when God created man, what he created was a certain self. That's the name of the entity. And the self is an entity who fundamentally, his function is to know that he is. In other words, we get our sense of existence from this sense of self, from this entity called a self. It tells us that we are. It tells us how we are. So therefore we see that existence is something different than we usually think of it. It's not simply a process which gives something being. That the being of a self comes from the self. It's self-contained. Somehow this being called man knows that he is. He's self-aware. God, who is also a being that knows himself, has this too. So the question is, what's the difference between the self-awareness of God and the self-awareness of a person? That's the question. And the answer is fundamental. Self-awareness is actually a divine quality. To know that you exist on your own, by yourself, through yourself, is what contributes to divinity. But the difference between your divinity and the divinity that God gave you, because mankind knows himself through himself, and that is considered a divine being. But there's a difference between the way God knows that he is and the way you know that you are. And what is that difference? Well, that difference is when we talk about our own existence, we say, I know myself. So we use two words to describe ourselves. I describes the being, and it says, I know, I am aware of myself. So when we talk about ourselves and the fact that we appear, you see it, we have to refer to ourselves as a duality. I and myself. I know that I am. I know myself. Because on a certain level, we cannot see ourselves. We cannot have a self-awareness, which is one thing. It's composed of two things, I and myself. But when God refers to himself, it's not that he possesses a duality in describing himself. When he describes himself, that description is him. In other words, God is absolutely synonymous with the knowledge of himself. except that we can't talk about God in that sense, because we must talk about him in a sense similar to us. We say that God knows himself. But that's not really true, because there's no distinction between God and himself. It is exactly the same being, and that's the unity of God. God and his sense of self are absolutely one. It is identical to itself. We cannot conceive of this type of being. What is the nature of a being who knows himself? When we describe this being, we refer to it as a duality. We refer to it as he knows himself. What God himself does not know himself, because he is not a duality. His knowledge of himself and the himself, the subject which has that knowledge, is exactly identical. He is an absolute unity. And we can't comprehend the unity of this being. We cannot comprehend the unity, the absolute identical unity of something that knows itself. That's the difference between God and us. Both of us have self-awareness, but he is his self-awareness. He doesn't have self-awareness. He is the self-awareness with an absolute unity. I, as a human being, possess self-awareness. I know myself, and even though I know myself as myself, it's still a duality. But with God, it's a unity, and we cannot comprehend that thought. So we see something different about man. Man has a knowledge that he is. And with this knowledge, he has a certain divine quality. So therefore, man is a semi-divine and has a quality that he knows himself. And this is actually the definition of divinity. A man is called the image of God. The Torah says that God says to the angels, God said to them, I want to create a man who's a Tselem Elokim. He's a mirror image of God. What does that mean, a mirror image of God? Does he appear like God? Does he look like God? No, a mirror image is that he in a certain way replicates the fundamental property of what he is. So man replicates this concept of divinity. And in that sense, man is said to be divine because he replicates the concept in reality. But God is a principle. It's as if God looks in the mirror. And when God looks in the mirror, he sees what? What does God see when he looks in the mirror? And the amazing answer is that God sees man. That's right. When God looks in the mirror, if that were possible, which is not, what would he see? He would see something that appears like him. And what quality would that be? That's the quality that he knows himself. That's the quality of self-awareness. That when God would look in the mirror, if that were possible, he would see an entity who has self-awareness. Because that's the greatest quality that God has. God has existence through his knowledge of himself. Intrinsically. And what we say is that this is a shadow of God. Therefore, mankind is called the image of God. And as such, mankind is what? Mankind is an entity which has a quality of God in himself, but in man, that quality of his knowledge of himself is a duality. There's he and there's himself. But God has this quality of an exact unity. He is his image. He is himself. We cannot comprehend what that is. But now we see much better who God is. God is nothing more than the entity, not really an entity. He is his own knowledge. He is the knowledge of himself with an exact entity of that. So that's how we know that mankind is what? That's how we know that mankind is somewhat similar. So that tells us to some degree how God created man. In a certain sense, God created man in a certain sense where God created a mirror. And then he looked in the mirror, and what he saw in the mirror was an image of himself. What's that? Someone who possesses the knowledge of himself. That's it. That's all he had. And that's what it means that man is what? Is in the image of God. It means he has the one critical concept, but he has it as a duality. He and himself. But in that duality, he's somewhat similar to God. And that's what David HaMelech says. When you compare man to God, man is similar to God. How? That he possesses self-awareness. He possesses the knowledge of himself by himself. So we begin to see the greatness of man. You see, we all think, when we look at a person, especially the physical universe, we see limitations. We see restrictions. Mankind is in a body, and he's limited to the space of his body, to the substance of his body, to the position of his body. But that's not what a man is. A man is a being called a self, where he has a knowledge of himself by himself. And in that sense, he is a quasi-divine being like God, except that God doesn't possess a knowledge of himself. There's no duality in that. God and the knowledge of himself are exactly identical, and we cannot have a comprehension of that. But we do understand now the fundamental quality of God as it's possessed by man. So therefore we see that in truth, we really have no idea who we are. And this starts the question. The question is, why does God give man pain? Well, the real question is, who is man? What is man? And now that we understand that there's no such thing as existence. Existence is a thought. Existence is some kind of reality, which is what man is a part of. But man is not a part of reality, because reality says that there's something called a network of many entities, a multiplicity of many entities, which have existence. But what we really see fundamentally is that there's no such thing as existence. There's no such thing as a process. Ontology, which is a study of being, says that there are two things true of everything in the universe. It possesses a definition. It possesses an essence. The essence of an item is what it is, the qualities that define the entity. In addition to the qualities that every entity in existence has a certain definition, in addition to that, it also has the fact that it is. So every entity possesses an essence which answers the questions, what is this? And in addition to this, it possesses the concept that it is. So every item in the world, without question, has an essence, its definition, and has existence. One is the question, who it is. The second is the question, that it is. And these are two separate concepts. But with God, they're not separate concepts. They're the same concept. Who he is and that he is the same thing. And therefore he cannot be comprehended because there's no distinction between his essence and his existence. Even to say the sentence, God is false, because God and his existence are not separate. They are not two distinct items. They are the same thing. Man is in the image of God. He possesses existence in the sense that he has a knowledge of himself, and so on. But what we see clearly is that man is not someone that you think he is. You see, we are all fooled and deceived. When we look at each other and we see ourselves in a body, we think that we are a limited being in a body. But that's not really what you are, because you are not your body. You are not even your soul. You are not a physical being, which has tremendous limitations. And you are not what? You're not a spiritual being, which has also limitations, but less limitations than your body. What you really are is a certain type of entity that has total knowledge that it is of itself. That's it. And that was the gift of God. God allowed us to know ourselves, to be aware of ourselves. And this which gives us a certain divinity. So therefore, God never created man. And I know this is hard to conceive. What God did was he withdrew from man and gave him the gift of self-awareness. And that's the gift which somewhat makes him like God. Now, this concept creates a very great problem. Because since God did not create man, which means mankind does not come from nothing. When you create something, you create something from nothing. But mankind was never created from nothing. Mankind has the quality which is somewhat identical to God. That God has the complete knowledge of himself because he is the knowledge of himself. And when God withdrew from that quality, out came man, who has a similar quality, except it exists in a duality, not in one way. So in a certain sense, God never made a person. He never created him from nothing. He simply withdrew from himself. And suddenly the quality of essence, what a thing is, and existence, as that a thing is, suddenly emerged. So in mankind, these two qualities are a duality. In God, these qualities are not a duality. They are God. He is his own knowledge of himself completely. And that cannot be comprehended. But that's what happens when you create a quasi-divine being. You see, what's the real question? You know, there's one thing that God cannot do. That's right. There's one thing that God cannot do. God can do anything and everything except one thing. And you know what that is? God cannot create another God. That's right. Because if he was able to create another God that knows itself by itself, that other God would be outside of God. But you see, God has no outside. When it says there is nothing like God, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that there's only one God. There just doesn't happen to be more, but there could have been more. It means that there cannot even be another God. Why? Because technically speaking, God has no outside. That's right, there's nothing outside of him because there doesn't exist an outside. Since he and his manifestation are the same thing, there's nothing that we can manifest except him. So when God wanted to create a being and give that being eternity, he said, I'm going to create a being who is most similar to me, God. Of course, I cannot create another God because that's impossible. I have no outside. There is nothing that exists outside of me. There's nothing that can exist outside of me. I have no outside. But the one thing that I can create, which is somewhat similar, that it has an appearance as if it's outside, is man. So when God established the human being from himself, through himself, and he made man, that was the closest being that was similar to him. So in a certain way we say that when God wanted to create another God, the closest thing that he was able to reach to make that is man. Man is an entity which is most like God. Why? Because he knows himself by himself. So technically speaking, when mankind is aware of himself, it's as if he's an outsider God. And therein lies the problem. It's a vast problem. Because God established mankind as an entity, which he established, which has self-knowledge. But when you have self-knowledge, in a certain sense, you are like outside of the one who knows you. And this is the problem that God has, that he does not have with any entity other than man. No other entity has a self that is self-aware, and that technically is someone outside of God. So when you possess the ability to know yourself by yourself, it's almost like you are independent. And this is the greatest quality of all. What does it mean, independence? Independence means that you know that you are by yourself. You don't need anyone to tell you who you are or anyone to give you a sense of your own awareness. That awareness comes from you. It is you. It's not totally you because it's only the you of God, but it's certainly like a you. And therefore, this gives man a somewhat quasi-ability of divinity. When man looks at God, he says the word you. That's right. He says about himself, me. I'm a me because I have my own self-knowledge. And that self-knowledge sees the you. So when mankind looks at God, he sees God as outside of him. But the truth is God really outside? No. God is inside of man. And that's the unique thing. God is not outside of man. He's inside of man. God is the foundation of his own self-awareness. God is the foundation of man's self-awareness. He gives man the ability to be self-aware. So therefore, to the human being who says me, when he sees God as if he's outside. And because he sees God as if he's outside, he has a certain illusion of independence. Because he said, I'm outside of you, and therefore I am independent of you. How? Because I know that I am by myself. So therefore I am outside of you. So in that sense, man thinks that he is God. He thinks he is God because he sees God as a you. And therefore he assumes that just like God is his you, you are God's you. When God sees you, how does he see you? He sees you as outside of himself. So therefore, you have an illusion. It's a deceitful illusion that you are outside of God. And what gives you that? The fact that you are self-aware. Your self-awareness creates the illusion that God is outside of you and that you are outside of God. And this creates a tremendous problem. Why? Because what it means is this. The fact that mankind has self-awareness, that he knows himself by himself. The fact that that's called centrality. What does that mean, centrality? It means that his awareness, which is outside of him, makes him central to the essence of reality. That reality starts with man's perception of himself. Reality starts with the knowledge of man as a me. I am me. And that he sees God as outside of the me, and that God is a you. When he refers to God, he says you. And when he refers to himself as the central source of awareness, he calls himself me. But that's an illusion. God is not really outside of man, and God is not a you. And man is not a me. The truth is, it's the reverse. God is the only me that can say that. When God says me, he's referring to someone who has no outside. And he's a true me. He has true centrality, total centrality, because there is nothing else. But when mankind says me, and he sees God as outside, it's an illusion. It's a deception. He has an illusion of centrality. But this makes a great problem, because when man sees himself as outside of God, and God is outside of him, when he has that illusion, mankind says, I am a me, and you are a you. And he says, I don't need you to exist. I don't need you to give me existence. I already possess existence because I have a knowledge of myself. So suddenly there's a great problem which is created. It's the problem with how can you create someone to be somewhat like God and then say to that someone that you want to give him the gift of eternity. What he says is, I don't need your gift. Why? Because I know that I am. This knowledge of my own being is in me. It's from me. It's through me. So therefore, I have the same quality that you have. I have the quality of independence. And that's the one quality that is true of God. If you look at God, you want to see what quality did God possess that makes him God, and the word is independence. God does not need anything else. He does not rely on anything else. God has a knowledge of himself totally by himself. And there's nothing that exists outside of God but God. So therefore, God is totally independent. He doesn't need anything. He doesn't require anything. He is complete in himself. But when God gave this quality to some extent that he possesses, mankind has the same flaw. Mankind suddenly sees himself as outside of God, where God is a you and he's a me. But that's false, because mankind cannot exist without God as his foundation. He is the foundation. God is the foundation of man's self-awareness. And that's what makes him somewhat similar to God. But of course, he is not God. And it's the biggest mistake that mankind thinks that a man could be God. Because the real truth is, to be a God means that you have no outside. There's nothing independent of you. You are complete, totally on your own, forever and ever. There's no time. There's no space. There's no substance. And there's no action. When you are God, you are total, complete, independent of everything. Mankind simply has the possession of the illusion of independence because he sees himself like God. But that's the mistake. What God says to man is the following: I made you and I gave you the gift of self-awareness. And with that gift, you think that you're me, and who am I? I'm a you. But that's the mistake. I'm the one who's me. I'm the one who creates reality. I have total centrality. There is nothing outside of me. So therefore, I am the only one that can really say me. And therefore, if I say me, I call you you. That's how I call you. You are a you, and I am the me. You think that you're the me, and I'm the you. No. So God says, unless you realize this concept, that you are simply a you, that's seen from me, that you have to get over this fallacy. Because if you don't understand this fallacy and you think that you're independent of me, like I'm independent of you, you trouble. Because I cannot give you eternity. Why? Because you will reject it. Your illusion that you're a me and I'm a you gives you the illusion that what? That you already exist by yourself, through yourself. That's the problem. So when God wanted to be, through his goodness, develop the man to what? To have eternity, he suddenly was in a great deal of confusion. It was a great deal of an illusion, because you cannot give eternity willingly to something which is fundamentally only has an illusion of independence, but no real independence. So the problem is that God made man through himself and established a person called man. And he gave man the ability to be self-aware and to partially see himself with a centrality where when he sees God, he sees God as outside of him. But God is not outside of man. He is inside of man. He is the foundation of his own self-awareness. God is the foundation of self-awareness. And therefore God is not a you. God is the ultimate me. But since the person has the illusion that he is also a me, and that he's independent of God, he rejects the gift of eternity. And this problem is the deepest problem of all. How could God give eternity to someone who rejects it, who thinks that he's already independent of God because he sees God as outside of him? And all of that is an illusion. So the only thing that God can do in this case is he has to say to mankind, you have to become aware of this truth. And by becoming aware of this truth, that you are not outside of me, I'm inside of you, you will accept eternity, which is the gift I give you. So this is what happens. Mankind, therefore, when he's created, is put in a universe which is physical. Why is he put in a universe where he's physical? Because the universe which is physical means that he therefore thinks of himself as multifarious. You know, only in the physical universe are the more than one being. Multiple, it's called multiplicity. When God created the physical universe, he created the illusion of multiplicity, of the existence of many different entities. So therefore man is supported in the physical universe by the illusion of multiplicity. And then God says to man, I'm going to give you a commandment to develop a relationship with you. But I want you to develop a relationship with me, knowing that I am not outside of you. I am inside of you. So therefore you will accept the gift that I'm going to give you, which is eternity. So therefore you have to do the choice. That's why God cannot do this for man, because man has to deal with his own creation. He has to deal with his own illusion that he is independent of God. God cannot do this for him, since the whole illusion comes from his self-awareness. Mankind must redevelop his self-awareness to understand that God is not outside, God is inside, God is the foundation of his awareness. So therefore God created Adam, the first man, and he said to Adam, you are what I made. You are at Tselem Elokim. You are, in my image. And even though as my image, you possess the ability to see yourself and to know yourself, but you have to understand that I am what? I am not outside of you. I am inside of you. And then you will not reject my gift. So Namlik Sufa, which means better shame, is a problem which is created by the greatness of man. Why does man have this problem that unless he produces something, he can't enjoy it? He feels disempowered. He only has this specifically because mankind thinks that he's outside of God. But this illusion exists because mankind is at Tselem Elokim. He is an image of God, and that's what creates the illusion. So the way to feel this thing is to give man free will, that the quality of a self-awareness gives him the free will to understand his true relationship with God, that God has no outside, but man does. And then when he understands this flaw and this incorrect view, mankind will suddenly say, yes, you are not, I am not outside of you, but you are inside of me. So what God does is to give man certain moral commandments. Commandments. God says, you are hungry, and I have made you to be hungry. But I want you to realize what? That you have to eat. But I don't want you to eat everything. There are certain things that I do not want you to eat. Why does God do that? Why is God interested in seeing what man eats? God is not interested in seeing what man eats, but God wants man to develop a relationship when he sees God as independent and superior. So the reason why God gives all these commandments of when man, what he should eat, what he should wear, the actions that he should take, how he should live. The only reason why God gives him commandments of how to conduct his life is that he has to obtain the information that there's no one else but God. God has no outside. And when mankind chooses to go against his body, to restrict his body to certain limitations, mankind is leaving the multiplicity. The physical universe creates a multiplicity of entities. And God says this multiplicity is an illusion that gives you the ability to see me as outside. But I'm not outside. You only have an illusion in the physical universe that there's more than one being. There's a multiplicity. So you think that you and I are a multiplicity We are not a multiplicity. I am your foundation. And the only way to realize that, to accept that, is to restrict your access to the physical universe. And that's what the commandments of the Torah are. The commandments of the Torah restricts man's aspect that he is not outside of God, that God is outside of him. So therefore, what God did was to give a human being different commandments, to declare that he is part of God. And only then, by declaring that he's part of God and he's dependent on God to exist, that he develops a relationship with God. Because a relationship with God can only be one truth, that you, God, are outside of me, but I am not outside of you. And I retract, I give up the belief that I am independent of you. And therefore I accept your gift of eternity, where there is no time, no space, no substance, and no action. So now we understand something. Mankind is in a very unusual space, because since he is a physical being that knows himself by himself, he thinks that he's what? Part of a multiplicity of many things. But God says there is no multiplicity. There's no such thing as multiplicity. There is only me, and there will never be anything else. And you exist inside of me. And I want you to know it, and I want you to accept the fact that it is I who give you eternity. You do not have eternity on your own. So we see that mankind's desire to become eternal. How? Because of power. You see, mankind is the only species that's in love with power. That's right. Animals have no desire for power. They just have a desire for survival, not power. But mankind loves power because power tells him that he is central. The gift of power tells him that he is central to reality. And God says, this is the source of your illusion, your centrality. And I want you to reject your centrality. You have no centrality. You are not the beginning and the end of what? Of manifestation. I am the manifestation, and you are part of my manifestation. You are not powerful on your own. And it's only when mankind chooses that possibility that suddenly he says, okay, I will now accept your gift of eternity. So what God says to man, you have to give up the illusion of power, the illusion that you're central, the illusion of multiplicity, and realize that only I have centrality, true centrality, because I have no outside. Mankind continuously defies God because mankind wants to establish his centrality, that he is the cause of what? Of multiplicity. He's the cause of reality, which is really a network of many entities. And he wants to believe, therefore, that he has the power to what? To instill multiplicity. So when he establishes that fact, when he acts in a way which he thinks gives him power, God wants to save him. Because in a certain way, God realizes that it's his fault. Why? Because he enabled it. When he created man with the illusion of power, he created that possibility. So what God does, he only therefore wants to save man because he loved man. Man is his child, and he loves him, and he wants to preserve him. And how does he preserve him? By giving him the contrary lesson, that whereas man sees himself as powerful in the sense that man dominates and wants to dominate, Man wants to build a kingdom. He wants to build an empire. He wants to take the command over life. He wants to do all these things because he wants to enlarge his belief in himself that he is the ultimate me. So what does God do? What is the way God acts mercifully? He makes man vulnerable. Vulnerable in many ways. Vulnerable in health. Vulnerable in what he acquires and possessions. By making man vulnerable, he gives man the knowledge that he is not the chief. He is not the great one. That man must rely on God for everything that God gives him. And when by making man vulnerable, when a person gets sick, he becomes vulnerable. When a person dies, he becomes vulnerable. When a person becomes poor, he's vulnerable. When a person is in pain, he's vulnerable. So God inflicts man with the state of vulnerability so that man should realize that God is the ultimate me and there is no one else. And it's only when mankind becomes vulnerable that mankind learns the lesson that he has to learn. He corrects the flaw that he has to correct, and he has to realize he has not total centrality. He is in the image of God, but he is not God. So we therefore see that mankind doesn't have to earn the future world. Mankind does not have to earn anything. Of course not. God does not require man to give him something back. God is only a giver. God is not a taker. But the reason why God has to concern himself with man's illusion, because man with his illusion of independence thinks that he can live on his own. He can exist on his own. How? Because the acquisition of power gives him that illusion. That's what fundamentally satisfies that illusion, that he is powerful. So therefore there's a dance between man and God, where man seeks power to become a divinity, and God continuously has to demonstrate to him that he has no power. All power belongs to God. And therefore, God created man physically so that he would have this illusion, and this illusion would be supported so that man can come to the realization that he's not independent of God. He is absolutely dependent of God. And therefore, that is the point of all this pain. All this pain is continuously challenges man and teaches man that he is vulnerable. It's unfortunate that man refuses to learn this lesson. Mankind wants to hold on to this quasi-divine nature that he possesses, that he thinks he's independent of God and that he can exist without him. Impossible. He cannot exist outside of God. No way. But mankind holds on to this power, to this illusion. So therefore, the only thing that God can do to correct this illusion, to correct the mistake that man makes in what? In believing that he is independent of God, is to inflict pain. Because pain is the only thing that teaches man that he is vulnerable. The pain that man has in his attempts to defy God and to reject God come back to him and continuously tell him over and over and over again that he is not independent of God, that he is totally dependent of God. So it's not that God wants to give pain. Of course not. God loves man and wants to give him everything. But God is concerned with giving first and foremost man the truth. And the truth is you cannot be independent of God. And when man defies God, God suddenly inflicts him with pain, which is the greatest teacher of all, that man needs God, cannot be outside of God. So therefore we have to understand the true what's going on, that the true nature of this world is that God wants to establish a relationship with man based on truth. And that truth is that there is no one else but God. God is the foundation of self-awareness. He's the foundation that man knows himself by himself. But at the same time, this foundation creates an illusion, which is not true. It gives man the false belief that he can be outside of God, that he is the me and God is the you. So this is the back and forth contest in all of human history. Is man outside of God, or is God inside of man? What is the truth? And the only way that man can achieve eternity is by fixing himself, attaching himself to the truth. That God has no outside, never will, never had. And only when man understands the true power that lies in God will he be able to submit to the true nature of God and to the true goodness of God. And then suddenly life will change. Life will change so that man suddenly becomes what? He becomes suddenly possibly eternal. He achieves eternity, but he achieves eternity by having a real relation with God. That God says, I have no outside. You are not my outside. Rather, I am your inside. And when you realize who I am, you will realize that you don't have power. I give power. You do not have it. And it's only when you realize this truth, and by keeping the commandments to limit your physicality, will I reward you the greatest gift of all. The fact that you are in my image, and the fact that one day you will exist beyond time, beyond space, beyond substance, and beyond an action. And this is what I want, and it will be one day. Okay. So I hope that I've been clear. This is a very subtle concept. It's very difficult. And you may have to go over it a number of times to truly understand what I'm saying. That there is no such thing as existence. There is none. There is only self-awareness and self-knowledge. But this self-knowledge has to be informed that it's only partially true. Because the self-knowledge comes from the God who is in me, not outside of me. And by establishing this self-knowledge, I will truly begin to become divine, and I will share and coexist with God for eternity.